Alum. They're doing great work and leading the way in Israel. They deserve another round of applause, in fact. Israel is so far ahead, they actually have volcano vaporizers in their oncology wards. So if you're dying of cancer, you can ingest as much cannabis as you want, which is about as civilized a thing that I think is happening anywhere in the world. And it's true that not enough patients there have access, but what access there is really remarkable and worth studying. Israel's doing really great things, and that's where so much of the endocannabinoid science is coming out of. And that's what I care about the most. I'm actually, I only have 20 minutes to summarize the endocannabinoid system. You feel really rushed because I'm actually working on a graphic novel on it, and it's going to take me about 135 chapters and 600 pages to lay out what the endocannabinoid system is and how widespread it is across our body. But that's not the heart of it, because everyone says they really care about science, but it doesn't get people in their guts. What gets people in their guts is knowing a medical patient. That's actually what the Drug Policy Alliance and Ethan Nadelman are always pounding down, is that the greatest predictor of your support for loosening, any kind of loosening of marijuana laws, isn't whether you smoke yourself or your libertarian views or anything like that. It's knowing a medical marijuana patient and knowing someone that it helps. And the thing is, it's so easy to find that around the elderly. And that's actually the heart of my book and the heart of the sermon that I came here to deliver. And I apologize, I'm a little bit under the weather, so I can't get as worked up as I normally do about weed for grandmas. But it is the most important thing I believe that is going to happen out of this marijuana liberalization movement. Our age and our people, we've always had access to weed. There's always been the risk of consumption, but the people who really never had the option of getting it was our parents and our grandparents and our aunts and our uncles. And that's where so much of the healing is. And so just to give a little background about the endocannabinoid system, so it makes sense why weed works so well for aging. The first quick poll is, who's heard of the anandamide molecule? There we go, that's a reasonable show. Or the CB1 receptor that it binds to? All right, a little bit more, great. Because that's actually so much of the work that came out of Israel relates to the endocannabinoid system. Because really, cannabinoid science is very much in its infancy as far as fields of science go. The THC molecule was only found in 1964. Just as the 60s were really heating up, did we finally learn, after 100 years of chemical hunting, what was the active ingredient that made weed work. And then it took about another 20 years until we found why it worked in the brain. And it's that hunt that I think is such a fascinating thing, because like so many plant medicines and drugs that we take, it turns out that these plants have molecules that are interacting with receptors of stuff that we already produce. And so to see the scientific journey of the cannabis plant, it really matches up so well to the opium plant, which is really the other major plant medicine that humans have always used. As far back, well before written records were kept, humans have been using opium and cannabis. We find the seeds and the smoking implements and the eating implements all over the world because they're great medicines. And even all those snake oil salesmen that were traveling the country with their shows 100 years ago selling tonics, most of those tonics had alcohol, cannabis, and opium in them. And you know what? That's a great mix of medicines. That works for a lot of different things, unspecific things. It heals in a lot of different ways. And the interesting part about cannabis and opium is that they help each other work. That's why opiate deaths in general have been dropping in all the medical marijuana states, because the patients need less of the addictive opiates because the cannabinoids help it work better. Cannabis is a reasonably good painkiller in its own right. But when you combine it with opiates, it works even better. You need less opiates to get the same job done. And that's one of the most important things that's coming out of this, because if there's anything that we have a hole for in our medical pharmacopoeia of drugs that we have as a society is chronic pain. We have really good things for acute pain, surgery, accidents, bashings, and gnashings. You can always get some kind of Vicodin, oxycodone to work, but they stop working and tolerance builds. And the crazy part about cannabis, on pain specifically, is that tolerance doesn't build. And that in all the different animal models tested for all of these different types of pains, and depending on what kind of scientist you are, there's at least 7 or 10 different types of pain that you would define it. Electrical, thermo, crushing, blah, blah, blah. And everything scientists look at, whether you're dosing mice or college kids, cannabinoids usually help lessen the pain. Not blockbuster, but at least to help the whole thing work. And that's one that's going to apply to so much of society. But bringing it back to the elderly in specific is the widespreadness of what the endocannabinoid system is. And the first thing we discovered was the CB1 receptor. And that was only in, I believe, 1988. Did some scientists put together what THC was doing in the brain. They found a receptor that was on the cells of your neurons that binds like a lock and key to not only THC, but to other things. And that's what these scientists often realize. If we possess a receptor for a drug that is outside of ourselves, then we probably have something similar to that drug that our body is already using. And that's why opium paved the way, because what we did about 100 years ago is we discovered the morphine molecule was the active ingredient in the opium plant, and that's what most of the pain killing came from. And it was just easier to find morphine. It's an easier drug to study than the slippery fatty lipids that make up the cannabinoids. And so with that morphine, it allowed us to drop a hook into our brains. And if your brain's like an ocean, which it very much is, it's filled with all of these fish, all of these neurotransmitters that we don't know what many of them do. Every neuroscientist is amazed at the mystery and the complexity of what's down there, and no one person has it all in their head. And so we're constantly searching for the ecosystems of what's happening in our brain. And it's almost like a phrenology level of what we know right now. And so the morphine molecule gave us a hook to send down, and we pulled up our own endorphin system. And it turns out that opium works so well because it enhanced our own endogenous morphine system that helped control our own pain. And the reason that the endorphin system was there was not only to help with pain, but also a lot of other activities as a reward for you. And in fact, when you look at your child, your brain floods with endorphins. That is the natural morphine, heroin type reward you get for taking care of this baby that, if looked at rationally, is actually a huge pain in the ass. It takes all of your money in the best years of your life and $1 million to get out of your house. But you get this reward that gets you addicted to the act of making more babies and taking care of this one that's in front of you. All of these neurotransmitters that we use as drugs, they exist as to help our own behaviors in an evolutionary, somewhat stable manner. And so just like the morphine molecule helped us find our endorphin system, the THC molecule, found 6 decades later, was the first clues to find our own endogenous cannabinoid system. And so first we found the receptors, and the first one we found was CB1 receptor. And that was so widespread across all the top parts of our brain that the scientists who initially found it thought that the probe they used must have been somehow completely unspecific and just binding to everything in the damn brain. Because you have CB1 receptors across all of these high-level processing parts of your brain. And the thing is that everyone's endogenous cannabinoid system is different. And each one of us is going to have different density of receptors in different parts of our brain, which is why one person gets sleepy, one person gets happy, one person gets angry, which does happen about 1% of the time. Someone likes to get smoked and fight. But all of these men, everyone gets high in a different way. I've been collecting people's stories for about 3 years straight about getting high, and at least once a week, someone tells me something. I'm like, wow, I didn't know that could happen when you smoke pot. But there it is, you experienced it. And it's fascinating, and the only reason that is because it's such a density of receptors. It's actually the most G protein couple receptors in our brain. And those are these really complex receptor systems that about 50% of the pharmaceuticals on the market today target one GPCR receptor. And so of that entire class of receptors, CB1 is the most widespread in the brain. So that's how damn important it is. I mean, it's pretty amazing in its way. But that's also where the psychoactive effects come from. And that's what you have to be most careful about when you're getting weed into grandmas. Because for the most part, our grandparents don't want to get high. you see a lot who used to smoke pot in the 60s and they stopped in their 30s because they had kids and it was a pain and it just didn't work for them like it did. And then they rediscover it when they're 50 or 60 and then they want to get back into it. They enjoy the fact of getting high and they realize it helps with aches and pains. It helps their other medications work better and things like that. But the one thing we know that's the most important for the elderly is with all of these CB1 receptors, the data for the neuroprotection qualities of the cannabinoids is overwhelming. We have so much data, not only from tens of thousands of mouse trials and all these different types of diseases, but also a lot of clinical trials. There's about 20,000 people in America that went through clinical trials for various diseases. And so any of the neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, ALS especially, if you know anyone with Lou Gehrig's disease, they need to be trying CBD and THC. And the one we have the best clinical data for is actually MS, because multiple sclerosis is not only a neurodegenerative disease of the brain, it's also an autoimmune disorder, which is what happens when your body attacks itself. And so the autoimmune disorders are, the thing about weed is it works so well on the autoimmune disorders like diabetes, arthritis, lupus, Crohn's disease, that there are scientists who are theorizing that at our base, autoimmune disorders are actually a shortage of endogenous cannabinoids in that part of your body. Yeah, I'm in your nose. And so in your guts, maybe you don't have enough receptors, and all you need is a little bit more to just stop your body from attacking its own intestine system. And in the brain, and so the autoimmune disorder thing isn't proven, what I just said, but it's suggested because the data is so damn good for the autoimmune disorders. If you know anyone was struggling with that, get them CBD oil from Bluebird Botanical out of Colorado. That, by the way, is the most important thing I can preach, is that if you know anyone who wants to try it, it's so easy. You can get this non-psychoactive molecule that does so much of the healing from the cannabis plant, and you can order it from Colorado to anywhere in the 48 states with your credit card. And that's the kind of thing that might convince your elderly relative who never smoked pot and is nervous about this stuff. If you tell them this won't get you high, you can order on the internet, it's just droppers of oil you put in your tea in the morning, that can help convince people. The other thing that helps convince any patient is the stories of other people. And it makes it so easy because any disease you know, just type into YouTube that disease and weed or marijuana, and some patient will come up and say how they used it and how it helped them. And if you want the actual scientific data, feel free to find me, and I can send the clinical trials and the preclinical trials of what works. But usually that doesn't actually convince people. People's stories is what convinces people, and that's what the internet's rife with. And that's the hard part, is that most of the people making these claims are stoners, and most people don't believe stoners because because, and so But the crazy part is, when they're going off about how incredible this drug is as a healing plant, they're not over-exaggerating. I have about 100 different diseases I would like to list in my book that I believe there's enough evidence between all the mouse and rat data and monkey data that's been generated, along with the clinical trials that have been limited, and especially the anecdotal evidence from across the country that's overwhelming. And that's what's the hardest part about being a scientist in this age, is that right now science only counts if it's clinical peer-reviewed trials that are double-blind. And it's very hard to double-blind a weed trial because you know if you're getting high or not, usually. But the amount of old ladies in the woods across the country who said, this is the drug that worked for me for this crazy little disease that not even my doctor had ever heard of. And we tried every pharmaceutical that could be tried on this, and it didn't work. And I never gave a shit about smoking weed, but we tried it because I was on my last legs, and this was the thing that changed my life. And I've heard that story so many times for such a wide swath of diseases that it never ceases to overwhelm me. And so that's the main message that I have to share, is the CBD molecule that you can get online right now is the best entry point for any elderly person in your life who might be willing to try the medicine. If they might be interested in THC, it often helps things work, but like anything, weed has its harms. the slight risk of bringing out a psychotic episode, and people are already predisposed in that way. The fact of being just way too high. An elderly person's system gets high easier, they get drunk easier, they're more susceptible to this stuff. And the one ingestion method that I think you have to be the most careful with when trying to get anyone above 50 or 60 to try this is edibles. That's where you have to be the most careful, start with the very lowest doses, because when you eat an edible, it actually takes the THC, and when it's in your liver, it changes it into 11 THC, which is about 4 to 7 times more potent. And so that's why you can get so much higher from the edibles, and probably most people in this room have had a terrible weed experience because of an edible. I see some hands in the back, and I know there's some others here too. Like it is the most dangerous ingestion method in its way. It's also the best in terms of a nice long way to get the cannabinoids into your system. But I personally think the tinctures are the best way. If you're going to take cannabis every day, a tincture in your tea in the morning and maybe a little bit more at lunchtime is a great way to chronically treat whatever disease you might be dealing with. And then the other great ingestion method is the vape pens, and that's your acute ingestion method. If someone's having a flare-up of spasticity from Parkinson's or MS, or they're having a pain flare or an anxiety attack, or anything like that, CBD helps so well to activate your body's endogenous cannabinoid system, calm down your mental state, modulate your immune system to help fight all kinds of things, and is really an incredible general tonic for the system. If we know anything about the endocannabinoid system now, it's that it's the homeostasis system for the body. It's the balancer. And it would make anandamide, if serotonin is your happiness molecule and dopamine's your addiction molecule, and you use all these shorthand terms that drive neuroscientists crazy when you put things in a category like that, this widespread anandamide molecule that is very similar to THC, that functions as some kind of molecule of balance across your body. And that helps to explain why weed works on such a vast number of diseases. Wherever things are going wrong, it helps to just slowly tweak them and smooth it out and hopefully help. So if you have any questions about specifics, feel free to find me, and I want to get weed into any elderly people. So that's my mission, and I'm here to help. Questions, Science? Yeah.
First, thank you for all the knowledge that you just lay on us, because you covered, I went to a semester at Oakland University, and you covered half of my whole semester in 20 minutes.
Thank you.
Two things. What is the name of the tincture oil?
Bluebird Botanicals. Bluebird. Yeah, think about the Bluebird of Happiness sitting on your shoulder. Yeah, don't forget, they're a great manufacturer, and they're the kind of, when you talk about companies that have a heart, like Tico and Ulam, as well, Bluebird Botanical is like that. I have a friend here in the city, and she's on limited income, and she told them that, and they gave her a coupon for 50% off for life. Yeah, they're that kind of operator. There's a lot of hustlers out there. There are people like Dixie Botanicals that are pumping out. If you look up hemp oil or hustlers, Project CBD did a test. They're selling the lowest quality CBD oil made from industrial hemp waste byproducts. Yeah, and I interviewed them right before this story broke, and I missed the whole thing. What kind of journalist am I? Yeah, and it's filled with toxins, and that's the problem with so much of the medicine that's coming out of certain commercial operations and where things are going. And dabs as well, is you're concentrating the medicine, but you're also concentrating any bad stuff that would be put inside it. And if someone tells you that they're making organic pot, it's almost an impossibility to do that. Usually there's that last one thing that you see on the edge of their grow that's not organic. And there's, being inorganic is kind of the way you have to play the game to survive. But there's very different levels of quality. And the little secret is, especially for pesticides, these testing regimens aren't gonna find most things. There's so many tens of thousands of pesticides to check for that it's almost overwhelming. Molds you can somewhat test for, but pesticides are really going to be one of the trickiest parts for regulations.
So how do you feel about, pharmaceuticals only, in my opinion, the pharmaceutical company is really only for palliative things, so they don't really address the actual root cause. So do you feel And all these diseases and all these cancers, they really have an effect on the population and how they spend their money. And people are not really knowledgeable about what goes on. So do you think that there is some balance between palliative symptoms, or in that root cause? Like, do you think that, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it is the habit now to extend treatment instead of curing base causes. And there's it's not as bad. The pharmaceutical companies aren't as bad as they are often painted. They are a business, and the unfortunate part of the data is, of the major 400 diseases that humans get, only about the first 20 or 30 of them are worth the return on investment of the $1 billion it costs to make a drug. Some of these companies are actually probably would be good operators, and they'd like to help people for more lesser known diseases, but they can't. They have to show shareholders, and they're the only ones that have money to put on clinical trials. There's not many organizations like MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. They're trying to do PTSD studies out of Colorado, but for the most part, no one even the federal government doesn't have the money to run trials. So my general opinions on the pharmaceutical companies and cannabis is very, very unpopular. So I'd be glad to share them with you today. Because there's hundreds of synthetic cannabinoids out there, and spice and K2 are the ones you hear about, and that takes your CB1 receptors, and because THC is a partial agonist of the THC receptor, or the CB1 receptor. It holds it down like 30%, maybe. Some of these synthetic cannabinoids take your CB1 receptor, they hold it down for hours at 100%. So humans are getting higher than weed ever could have gotten you. And that's not a good thing for those drugs. But the thing is, with all of these hundreds of synthetic cannabinoids, they can also be great medicines that use your body's endocannabinoid system in very specific ways. I mean, weed can't pass an FDA standardization. Because weed's not one drug. Weed is many, many drugs inside one plant. And the FDA's model, whether you like it or lump it, it is a one plant kind of thing. And botanicals don't fit well in that. It's not even as much. FDA goes for science, but they like standardization. That is what they were put there to do. And so what the synthetic cannabinoids open up is for very severe treatments for people dealing with ALS or gliomas, which are the brain cancers that kill you within a year, and for all these really sick kids with epilepsy. It's clear that the cannabinoids are helping them, but what if we found a synthetic cannabinoid that has even less side effects, that is even more targeted in the brain, that gets even better healing done? Maybe one of these will be a better medicine for certain types of epilepsy than others. Because the thing is, for some types of epilepsy, cannabinoids do make it worse. And so there does need to be more data of where these help and where they hurt. And so I think the most important thing in the policy side is you have to have home grows. That's the most important thing you put into any law that keeps big business out. Guys in business suits aren't always bad, but if they never smoke the medicine and they're only in it for the profit, it makes for a system like Washington that looks quite ugly. I'd say Washington's the worst state to look at in terms of legalization, because on the west side, it's a bunch of suits who don't care about the medicine, making a bunch of money, and everyone who was in the game before is promptly shut out. They're either still in jail, or it's a Vietnam vet, or a medical edible maker grandmother who thought they were going to be making these medicines all the way into their retirement, and all of a sudden they can't get into the markets now. And that's why I think a state like Colorado has a really good system, because it's, they charge a tourist a bunch of money to go into the pot shops, and they charge them a bunch of tax, which everyone likes taxing the tourists. But if you're local, you get a medical card and you get your untaxed cannabis for medical conditions. But it's taxed. It's a pain in the ass enough that there's still a black market for the people we like that we grew up going to. All those nice weed dealers who came to your house for all those years, they need a retirement plan too. And they need to get in that game too. And so Colorado's done a really good job at that. And Washington, I think Washington's the scariest, because what you see is on the east side, you have all of these cops who the laws weren't quite written. You can still bust kids. And so they're busting kids they don't like, hippies and people of color mostly, and they're the same cops using the same laws. And just like New York State decriminalized, I don't know how long ago, it doesn't matter what the law actually is. The law is local. And as Harry Levine out in Brooklyn always says, one of the best academics on this stuff, and that rule about public view is a great tool that the cops have used to knock down those people as they like to. And so as tricky as the medicine is, at least you hope that there's an answer in there, that there is a best practice that everyone can agree on. The thing about policy is there is no right answer. It's always this messy thing in between all the competing interests, and that's why my hat's always off to the activists and the policymakers who are out there fighting for the nuts and the bolts that don't excite anyone else, that really affect who gets access to the medicine. And to me, that's the most important. The two most important aspects are keeping people out of prison for a plant, and on the negative side, and on the positive side, getting that plant out to patients as a cheap, easy medicine. So, yeah.
Are you aware of any new regulations that are coming forward for, I read a lot about the testing industry for cannabis. I mean, the incentives are for testers to really pass any grow, just because the grower will go to another testing facility that will approve their product. Are you aware of any regulations to really curtail that? Because there's a lot of product going out into the market that's really not clean and that's grown with some pretty nasty chemicals.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'd say that and the driving question are probably the two most distinctly thorny issues in writing the laws. And that's what makes all of these 23 medical states so interesting, is that each one is a testing ground of different laws and what works and what doesn't. And it somewhat suggests that having the state in charge of testing, or having them certify the testing facilities, would be a good thing, with blind samples and surprise inspections, and making sure that these are very rigorous testers. Because especially you hear about it in Washington State, where there are fly-by-night operators who are like, yeah, 25% no pesticides, everyone, yeah, just stamp them. But it's not all hustlers either. It's very difficult to test this plant. I mean, it took us about 70 years of chemical hunting to just find the cannabinoids initially. And they're still not an easy thing to quantify, especially when you're talking about edibles. At least the plant itself, you can break down somewhat, but edibles are notoriously hard to test with how strong they are. And so, it's going to be a really interesting question of who gets to inspect this stuff and what counts as inspected. I mean, yeah. What's that?
I'll be inspected.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, we've got volunteers all through the place, I'm sure. But I mean, if I had to write some kind of general policy, it would be something like, if you aren't making money off the plant, you treat it like tomatoes. The Ed Rosenthal method, where you give it away to anyone you want, no one tests it, no one, you can do anything you want with your tomato plants, you can have as many of them as you want. But then if you want to have something that's recreationally for sale, it has to have some minimal level of testing, it needs to know where it comes from, it needs to be safe enough for, buying from the deli. You know that the rot gut whiskey you buy from the deli isn't great for you, but it's not going to kill you. And that's kind of the level you're going for with recreational. But then, medical, you want it to be untaxed if you can. You need to keep that as cheap as possible. But you don't want the California method where everyone's going into the medical system and overwhelming it or misusing it. But you want it to be as cheap a medicine as possible. And if you have medical weed, it goes through incredibly rigorous testing. And the people administering it have to really know their stuff. They'll probably license bud tenders at recreational stores because the state loves giving licenses to everybody. If you do hair, you need a license. If you do acupuncture, you need a license. If you sell weed to people, you're probably going to need a license. But how much that requires is going to be one of the important things we figure out. Because the doctor training now to give out recommendations in this state. My friends who have gone through the doctor training, they're like, of all the continuing education things I've ever done as a doctor, this might be the very worst I've ever seen. The people who wrote these things apparently don't have a clue what the drug is. It's like straight out of Hunter S. Thompson at the drug convention in Fear and Loathing. But they're trying. They really are. And things are loosening up. And even a cynic like myself thinks that they might not go backwards after this next election cycle changes everything. But they easily could. The job is not done. This is just like the end of the 70s. Jimmy Carter came in, everyone thought weed was going to be legal, the whole drug war is going to really fall apart. Then his drug czar did a line of coke with Hunter S. Thompson, and Keith Stroup of Normal dropped the dime on him for that. And it was a big scandal. Then Carter wouldn't touch drugs, and then Reagan came in, and the darkness fell. And the war on drugs took on machinations that are just horrible to what happened to civil liberties, and international CIA complicity is overwhelming and dark. And right now, we're in a similar position. Another liberal president who people like, but a lot of people don't. And we have a really close election cycle. And if the next president isn't someone amenable to this, all of this good stuff could get pushed back. Or maybe the weed stuff doesn't get pushed back that hard, but all the other drug stuff that needs to be changed around the war on drugs does. And so we can't stop fighting. Whatever method that you do your fighting, whether you're a provider or an activist or a speaker or just someone who talks about this and posts it to Facebook, the most important thing you can do is add your shoulder to the wheel and add your voice, because that's the thing that will change hearts and minds and get this medicine out there.
Just bringing this back to giving weed to grandmas. Like an old person that's sick, they usually have 5 to 10 different medications that they might be on. Is there any studies about how CBD could interact with some of these?
Good man, very good man. It's a great question, and it's a really tough question. In general, the interactions of any of the cannabinoids with other drugs is so low that it's rather astounding compared to other pharmaceutical drugs that are out there. But like any drug, it can have an effect, especially CBD, because it's so mysterious. It doesn't bind to CB1 or the CB2 receptor, but it does about 65 other targets across the cell and across different body parts where CBD does something, which is really astonishing. I mean, as far as drugs go, that is an incredibly pluripotent drug, as we say, but really that means dirty, messy, does anything she wants kind of molecule. And so, but in general, it helps other drugs work, especially the drugs having to do with neurodegeneration and with pain stuff. Is that you can, except if they get cut up by the CYP450 enzyme in your liver, which is a very technical thing, but a lot of drugs depend on getting cut up in your liver and then moving on to being an active drug. And sometimes CBD can interfere with that. But in general, the interactions are so low that it's incredible. And that's one of the reasons it's so important to get out there, because often for the neurodegeneration you can get more years or give back function sometimes. I can't promise that stuff, but I mean the craziest story I saw was 2 nephews, in fact, who were fairly well along on the Asperger's autism spectrum. And the 12-year-old, who was really not quite talking and interacting with people that well, I finally convinced his conservative Christian mother, wife of a pastor, to try the CBD oil. And she was pulling her hair out. She goes to conferences. She did everything she could to get this kid more communicating. That's it. She just wants to talk to her son more. And in about 3 months, he gained about 6 years of development. He's now playing basketball. He's hanging out with his grandma and shooting the shit. Like, he's now going to be able to leave the house and have a job. And she didn't think he was ever going to get out of assisted living. And that's the kind of stuff happening with cannabinoids in the brain that is so mysterious that it harkens to possibilities of drugs to come playing off of this, using it better, that is going to be a medical bonanza if we actually pursue it, which I hope we do. So yeah, that's my hope. Weed for grandmas.
Thank you, Lex. On that point, we had at the Cannabis Society of Massachusetts recently, we were honored to have Dr. Lester Grinspoon speak and present, who I don't know if anyone knows who he is. He's very awesome, very popular. He admitted to smoking cannabis for the first time with Carl Sagan at our event. It was great. But he basically had said as well that there's very little drug interaction with cannabis and other drugs. So it seems to be remarkably safe when it comes to mixing with pharmaceutical drugs. But tonight, Safe Access Night. This is about medical marijuana in New York. The program here, I'm sure as you all are aware, is quite fledgling at this time. There's very limited patients that have access, and there's a lot of actual dispensaries operating, but they have very limited products from what I understand. They're also very expensive products. So that's unfortunate. We reached out to Compassionate Care New York to be here to kind of present on some of the more specific issues that were wrong here in New York, and how we can kind of fix it. And I understand there's a lot of legislative bills that they've presented right now to try and add more conditions to the law and that kind of thing. But we have with us tonight the executive director of the Mass Patient Advocacy Alliance, which is the Compassionate Care New York of Massachusetts. It's the advocacy group that passed the ballot initiative in 2012 to legalize medical marijuana. So we are very honored to have here tonight Nicole Snow, and we kind of want her to give an overview, I think, of patient advocacy and how you guys might want to approach Compassionate Care New York and changing the law here to be a little bit more accepting for more patients. So with that, I'm going to introduce Nicole Snow of the Mass Patients Advocacy Alliance.